Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for one small favor. I'm working really hard to reach 1,000 subscribers, a milestone that truly means a lot to me. Please hit the subscribe button. Just one click, but it gives me huge motivation to keep making more videos. Thank you all so much.
The October train let out a long shriek before coming to a halt at Harlan Creek, releasing a plume of white steam that dissolved into the cold air, as if it too were exhausted from the journey. Through that mist, a woman stepped down. Elena Whitmore did not carry much with her. A canvas bag with frayed edges, her mother's cookbook with a cracked leather cover, and inside her inner pocket, folded into quarters, a marriage letter she had read enough times to memorize every rigid stroke of the handwriting. She also brought one more thing, something no one in this town was permitted to know. Before becoming a poor widow, the hands tightly gripping that bag strap had once held needles to suture wounds, pressed bandages onto bullet holes, and kept strange men alive for one more night on the battlefield. People said a decent woman should not know of such things, and so Elena had learned to bury them, as deeply as one buries the dead. On the platform, a man stood waiting, his hat pulled low, both hands tucked into his coat pockets. Caleb Hawthorne did not step forward. He simply stood there, watching her from afar, his gaze moving from the old bag to her worn-out heels, before resting on her face, not the look of a future husband welcoming his wife, but the look of someone weighing whether the goods he had ordered by mail were worth the money. "Mrs. Whitmore?" He did not ask. He stated her name like reading a line from a ledger. "Mr. Hawthorne," Elena nodded, keeping her voice entirely flat, having grown accustomed to such evaluating stares. She was just not used to the fact that it no longer caused her pain. "The road back is long and it is getting dark." He took her bag with one hand, as easily as lifting a weightless object, and turned to walk ahead. "The children have not had dinner." That was all he said. There was no word of welcome, no question of whether she was cold, hungry, or afraid. Elena followed, and as she sat in the carriage, she looked back at the station one last time, as if to ensure her path of retreat was truly closed. It was closed. Ahead lay the mountains, an approaching winter, and a house she had never seen belonging to a man she had never known. The Hawthorne farm emerged in the twilight like a large sleeping beast. Inside, the lamps flickered dimly, and as the carriage stopped, Elena heard the sounds of children from within. Not laughter, but the cautious noises of children used to keeping themselves quiet. The door opened and 7 faces turned to look at her. She counted silently, acting on the habit of someone who once had to count the living and those who were soon no longer to be living. An infant girl being held in the arms of the eldest, a little girl of about 5 or 6 cowered behind the doorframe, her eyes wide and bright. 2 school-aged boys. One stared at her intently while the other turned his face away. A scrawny boy coughed softly in the corner, and standing at the front of them all, acting as a small wall between her and the children, was a girl of about 16. "This is Abigail," Caleb said, setting Elena's bag down on the floor. "She manages the household chores. You can just ask her." Abigail did not reach out her hand. She only looked at Elena with eyes that were much older than her age, the eyes of a child who had replaced her mother too soon and paid the price with her entire childhood. "Hello, ma'am," Abigail said, polite to a chilling degree. "Your room is at the end of the hallway. I have cleaned it. Dinner is oatmeal. We eat at 6 o'clock and wash the dishes before 7 o'clock. We. Elena clearly heard the boundary in those 2 words. There was a we in this house, and she did not belong to it. She stepped inside, and the scent of sorrow hit her even before the smell of kitchen smoke. It was not because the house was dirty, though it truly was dirty, in the way a home lacking an adult's touch is always dirty, but because everywhere there remained the traces of someone who had passed away. The scarf hung on the hook that no one dared to remove. a pair of women's shoes placed neatly under the bed, already covered in a layer of dust. A house where the living were still residing around the empty space left by the dead, careful not to touch it, like walking around an unhealed wound. That night, lying in the room at the end of the hall, Elena listened to the wind seeping through the wooden cracks and the sound of some child crying very softly in their sleep. She lay perfectly still, hands resting on her chest, and for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to wonder if she had come to the right place, or if she had merely traded one loneliness for another. Elena was not the type of person to sit and wait for acceptance. The following morning, before the sky was even clear, she was already in the kitchen. She scrubbed the soot-covered pots and hung out the towels to dry. She found a jar of sourdough starter that was nearly dead and patiently nursed it back to life. She mended the holed socks that the children had worn right down to the heels. She worked quietly, demanding gratitude from no one, much like how she used to work in the murky medical tents, where no one had the time to say thank you, and where saving someone sometimes simply meant not giving up on them. But in this house, there was one person who did not want her to succeed. Mrs. Hester Crowley had managed the Hawthorne kitchen since Margaret passed away. She arrived every morning, a thin woman with a straight back and tightly pursed lips, and every morning she found a new way to remind Elena that she was merely a newcomer. The pantry key vanished exactly on the day Elena intended to bake. The yeast jar she had been nurturing was suddenly left by someone near the cold window for an entire night, dying completely. And when the women in town, Mrs. Prudence Bell with her tilted chin and Mrs. Edith Vale with her never-resting tongue, came to visit, Hester was the one pouring tea, the one smiling, the one speaking in a voice just loud enough for Elena to hear. "Poor Mr. Hawthorne. A poor woman all the way from St. Louis. They say she has nothing but the dress she is wearing. Marrying him is understandable, though. The land this family owns is certainly not small." Elena continued kneading the dough, not looking up, having learned that there were battles not to be won with words. But then Hester added another sentence, one she intentionally spoke a bit louder, just enough to echo out to where Abigail was standing on the porch. "And at the end of the day, how could a woman who has never given birth to a child ever understand the heart of a child?" Elena's hands froze in the dough. She did not turn her head, nor did she let anyone see a thing. Yet for a moment the entire kitchen seemed to darken, and she found herself transported back to the old house in St. Louis, where her mother-in-law had looked at her with that exact same gaze, speaking those exact same words on the day they buried her husband. What use is a woman who cannot bear a child to a man anyway? As if she had failed not as a wife, but as a human being. She exhaled very slowly, then resumed kneading the dough, just a little more forcefully. Out on the porch, Abigail stood quietly, and for the first time, something passed over the girl's face that was not entirely hostile. A vague confusion, as if that remark had not completely satisfied her in the way it was supposed to. Lily was the youngest child still able to walk, 5 years old with messy hair, and no clear memory of her biological mother. Perhaps it was exactly because she did not remember that the little girl was the first to approach Elena, because to her, Elena was not a replacement for anyone. She was simply a warm hand in a cold house. Lily followed Elena everywhere. She sat at the foot of the table when she kneaded dough. She would grab the hem of her dress when she went into the yard, and one night around midnight, while Elena was still awake by the lamp to finish mending some clothes, the little girl toddled down to the kitchen in a sleepy daze, tugged at her dress, rubbed her face against it, and mumbled, "Mama." The whole kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Elena leaned down, her heart pounding, both hands yearning to embrace the child more than anything else in the world. But before she could even touch her, a voice rang out from the stairs, as cold as winter well water. "You must not let her call you that." Abigail stood there, hands gripping the railing tightly, her face stark white under the lamplight. Elena stood up, very slowly, leaving Lily leaning against the chair leg. She did not argue, nor did she explain herself. She merely looked at the 16-year-old girl, who was trembling from a fear she herself could not yet name. And she said softly, "I know. I will not." Then she picked Lily up, only to take her back to bed, she told herself, and walked past Abigail, close enough to hear the girl's heavy breathing. She said nothing more. There are wounds that need no words, only someone who does not try to pry them open. That night, after placing Lily in bed, Elena sat beside her for a very long time, watching the tiny chest rise and fall. How could a woman who had never given birth understand the heart of a child? She smiled, a sad smile, thinking that perhaps it was precisely because she had never had a child of her own that she understood so clearly the feeling of a child waiting for someone to stay. Winter arrived without knocking. One late November afternoon, the sky turned a leaden color, and by evening a blizzard crashed down on Harlan Creek as if the sky had collapsed. The wind battered the wooden walls, snow piled into barriers outside the doors, and amidst that storm, Samuel caught a fever. It was not a mild childhood fever. The boy's forehead was so hot that Elena recoiled her hand the moment she touched it. His eyes were glazed over, his lips dry and cracked, and by midnight he began deliriously muttering sentences no one could comprehend. "We must call a doctor," Caleb said, already standing up, already reaching for his coat. "The road into town is flooded with snow," Hester stated from the doorway, her arms crossed. "No horse could make it through tonight. I am afraid. We can only pray." Elena did not hear the rest, for she was already kneeling beside Samuel's bed, placing one hand on his neck to check his pulse. And in that instant, the timid woman from the kitchen disappeared, replaced by someone else. Someone who had done this exact thing hundreds of times in the dark beneath gunfire, with no doctor to wait for. Abigail. Her voice was calm but permitted no argument. "Boil water, as much as possible. Jonah, gather all the clean towels in the house. Elias, there are some willow trees beyond the eastern fence. Do you know the spot? Scrape off the inner bark and bring it in here. Go with your father, take a lamp." No one asked why she knew these things. In an emergency, people follow the one who does not panic. Elena removed some of Samuel's blankets. Hester objected in shock, asking how she could take off his blankets when it was this cold. But Elena did not stop. She wiped his body with cool water to bring down the fever, boiled the willow bark into a bitter liquid, and patiently coaxed every single spoonful past his cracked lips. She stayed awake all night. Every 15 minutes, she would place her hand on his forehead, count his breaths, and start all over again. Caleb stood outside the bedroom door. He did not step inside, because that room was once where Margaret had lain, and because a fever was the very thing that had taken her away, because every time he looked in, he did not see his son but saw his wife, seeing himself standing helplessly at this exact threshold once again, unable to save the one he loved. That terror nailed his feet to the floor. Near dawn, Elena looked up and caught him there, in the dark of the hallway. A massive man shrunk down by grief. She did not blame him. She merely spoke softly enough for only him to hear. "You can be afraid. I am afraid too. But this child needs to see his father here when he opens his eyes. He needs to know that he is worth someone stepping into this room for him." Caleb stood perfectly still for a long time. Then, trembling like a person learning to walk again after a long illness, he stepped across the threshold. He knelt beside his son's bed, and for the first time since the day they buried Margaret, he held the hand of one of his children in that room without running away. By the time the first gray light of dawn slipped through the door cracks, Samuel's forehead had cooled down. The boy opened his eyes, looked around and saw his father holding his hand, and the newly arrived woman resting her head against the bed frame out of exhaustion. "I am thirsty," Samuel said, his voice hoarse but lucid. Caleb let out a sound that was half laugh, half cry, and Elena, without lifting her head, simply smiled. Samuel recovered in a few days. The house breathed a sigh of relief, but something had shifted that no one could name. As if a door had opened in a wall that people had always believed was sealed. One evening, Elena saw Abigail sitting alone on the steps, hugging her knees, staring out at the snow-covered field. She brought out a blanket, draped it over the girl's shoulders, and sat down beside her without saying a word. They sat like that for a long while before Abigail finally spoke, her voice small and fragile like melting snow. "I do not hate you," the girl said, still not looking at Elena. "I know everyone thinks I hate you, but I do not. I am scared. I am scared that if I like you, if I allow myself to get used to having you here, then one day you will also leave, like my mother. My mother did not mean to, I know, but she still left, and at that moment it was only me left having to take care of everything. I cannot do it all over again." Elena felt her chest tighten. She understood that fear better than the girl could have imagined. The fear of a person who has lost so much that they do not dare to love anything else. Because loving means having something else to lose. She did not hug Abigail, and she did not say she would never leave, for that is a promise no one has the right to make. She simply sat down a little lower, at eye level with the girl, and said, "Then you do not need to like me today. You do not need to call me anything at all. Just give me one chance. A chance to still be here tomorrow, and then tomorrow again. I will not ask you for anything more than that. Just one day at a time." Abigail turned to look at her. Her eyes were filled with tears, but, for the first time, there were no walls inside them. "Just one day," the girl repeated, as if testing whether she could endure that much. "Just one day." Elena nodded, and the 16-year-old girl, who had acted as a mother to her 6 younger siblings before she even had a chance to grow up, rested her head on the newly arrived woman's shoulder, allowing herself, for just one night, to be a child. It seemed as though everything would eventually be peaceful. But the winters in Harlan Creek did not allow anyone an easy life. One heavily windy night at the end of January, Elena was jolted awake by the smell of smoke. When she ran out to the porch, the stable was already engulfed in flames. The wind whipping the fires high into the sky, and the panicked neighing of horses echoing through the night. Then, a child's voice shrieked from somewhere inside the smoke. "Lily! Where is Lily?" Elena's heart seemingly stopped beating. The little girl had snuck out to the stable that afternoon, she remembered now, to find the rag doll that Margaret had once sewn for her. The doll she had left behind on a pile of hay, the final possession of the mother she did not remember. Caleb charged in first, but the smoke was too thick, and just a few seconds later, he stumbled backward, coughing violently, unable to open his eyes, dizzy from the heat. Elena did not hesitate for a single second. She ripped a towel from the clothesline, dipped it into the half-frozen water trough, wrapped it over her nose and mouth, and crawled low into that blazing red inferno. Within the smoke, every instinct learned from her past years returned to her. Stay low, breathe slowly, and navigate by memory rather than by sight. She heard Lily's faint coughing in the corner of the hayloft, traced it, and found the little girl, curled up tightly hugging the doll, too terrified to move. She pulled Lily into her arms, shielding her with her own body, and crawled backward along the exact path she had entered. They spilled out alongside a plume of black smoke. Lily coughed violently, and then burst into tears, the most beautiful sound in the world, because it meant the child was still alive. As for Elena, once she had placed the child into Abigail's hands, she collapsed onto the snow. One of her sleeves charred, her palms blistered from the burns. She fainted before she could even hear Caleb call her name. When Elena awoke, she was lying in her own bed, her hands bandaged, and surrounding the bed were 7 children. All of them were there, including Jonah, the one who always doubted her, now standing there with red, teary eyes. The quiet Elias was there too, while Lily had fallen asleep on the edge of the bed, still holding onto her hand with her tiny one. And Caleb sat on a chair beside the bed, his massive frame hunched over from exhaustion and from something far greater than fatigue. He saw her open her eyes, but he did not speak to her first. He turned to his children, and with a voice hoarse from the smoke, yet as solid as a boulder, he said, "Listen to me. Starting today, not a single person in this house is allowed to call her a stranger anymore. Not a single one. And not a single child argued back." Elena's hands gradually healed over the winter, and when the first patches of snow began to melt, revealing the damp, black earth and the first timid sprouts of grass. There was one afternoon when Caleb called her out to the porch. They stood in the exact spot he had stood on the day she stepped off the train, the exact spot where he had looked at her like a mail-order good, weighing whether she was worth it or not. For a long time he did not speak. This man, who was accustomed to silence, seemed to be struggling to find words he had never practiced saying. "I know why you sold your wedding ring," he finally said, making Elena look up in surprise. "Last autumn you thought I did not notice, but I saw that you were no longer wearing it. And then Lily had new shoes, Samuel had medicine, and there was new thread in the sewing kit." His voice choked up. "That ring was the last thing you kept of your husband, was it not?" Elena looked out at the field that was turning green again. "No," she said softly. "The last thing I kept was not the ring. The last thing I kept was a promise that if I could still do something, not a single child would have cold feet while I was still beside them." Caleb was silent for a very long time after that statement, and then he took his hat off. A small gesture, but from a man like him, it meant everything. "The first time I married you," he said, "I married you because I needed someone to stay. A housekeeper. I will not pretend otherwise, for I looked at you like a solution to a problem." He took a deep breath. "But now I stand here, in the exact spot where I did that shameful thing, and I ask you one more time, not because I need someone to keep house, but because I do not want to live in this house for one more day without you in it. Will you stay with me, Elena? Not as an arrangement, but as a chosen person." Elena turned back to look at him. The woman who had come to this place, empty-handed, who had been measured, who had been told she could not understand the heart of a child. That woman smiled, and within that smile were both tears and a peace she had not felt for a very long time. "I have stayed since the first day, Mr. Hawthorne," she said. "It merely took you a little too long to realize it. People often think that the most important individuals to step into their lives must arrive with grand promises, brilliant gestures, and heart-stopping moments. But sometimes that is not the case. Sometimes that person simply and quietly rekindles the hearth in a home that has been cold for too long. They mend a torn shirt or nurse back to life a yeast jar thought to be dead. They stay awake through an entire snowy night beside the bed of a child who is not their own. They crawl into a fire for a doll and a tiny life. And then one day, we look back and realize that this person, the one who arrived empty-handed, the one nobody wanted, has become home."
Thank you all for listening to me until the end of the video. I truly appreciate every second you have stayed here with me. Right now, we are on a journey to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. If the stories I tell have touched your heart, even just a little, please support me by hitting the subscribe button. Every single subscription is a huge source of motivation that helps me keep writing and continue bringing you more meaningful stories. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.